The smell of death hung heavy in the air that morning in Charleston, South Carolina. It was March 15, 1847, and the Whitmore plantation house was eerily silent. Inside the grand dining room, 3 bodies lay slumped over their breakfast plates. Master Thomas Whitmore, his wife Eleanor, and their eldest son James, all dead. The only sound was the gentle clinking of silverware as a young black woman calmly cleared the table, her face showing no emotion whatsoever. This was Hannah Morrison, and she had just changed the course of American history with nothing more than a handful of oleander leaves and a steady hand. But how did a kitchen slave become one of the most feared resistance fighters in the antebellum South? How did a woman who couldn't read or write orchestrate a revolution that would spread fear through the hearts of slave owners across 3 states? Before we dive into this intense journey, click the subscribe button, like the video, and comment below on what surprises you most about the resistance of slaves in the United States. This helps the story reach more people. To understand Hannah's story, we must first understand Charleston in the 1840s. This coastal city was the beating heart of the American slave trade. Ships arrived weekly from Africa, their human cargo sold at the old slave mart on Chalmers Street. The cobblestone streets echoed with the chains of newly arrived Africans, while wealthy plantation owners like Thomas Whitmore grew richer by the day. Charleston was a city of contradictions. Grand mansions lined the Battery, their wraparound porches overlooking Charleston Harbor, while just blocks away, slaves lived in cramped quarters behind their masters' homes. The city's economy depended entirely on slave labor, from the rice plantations along the Ashley River to the cotton fields stretching inland toward Columbia. Hannah Morrison was born in 1820 on the Whitmore plantation, located 15 miles northwest of Charleston along the Ashley River. Her mother, Celia, was the head cook for the plantation's main house, a position that came with both privilege and danger. Head cooks knew all the family secrets, handled all the food, and had access to every room in the house. They also bore the brunt of their master's anger when meals weren't perfect. Hannah's father was never officially acknowledged, but everyone on the plantation knew he was Thomas Whitmore himself. This made Hannah what was cruelly called a house slave, light-skinned enough to work indoors, but never light enough to be free. Her mixed heritage became both her greatest asset and her deepest source of pain. As a child, Hannah showed an unusual intelligence that both impressed and worried the other slaves. While most children her age played in the dirt between the slave quarters, Hannah would sit quietly in corners, listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. She had an extraordinary memory. She could repeat entire conversations word for word days later, and she never forgot a face, a name, or a slight. Celia recognized her daughter's gifts early. "Child," she would whisper as they worked together in the kitchen, "you got a mind sharper than any knife in this house, but sharp things can cut both ways. You use that mind wrong, and it'll be the death of you. You use it right, and maybe it'll be the death of them." The Whitmore plantation kitchen was Hannah's first classroom. Built as a separate building behind the main house to prevent fires, it was a world unto itself. The massive fireplace dominated one wall, with iron hooks for hanging pots and a complex system of cranes for moving heavy kettles. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ceramic jars of spices, dried herbs, and preserved foods. In the center stood a huge wooden table, scarred from years of chopping and preparation. It was here that Celia taught Hannah not just cooking, but survival. "Every plant got a purpose," Celia would say, grinding herbs with her mortar and pestle. "Some heal, some harm, some kill. A cook who knows her plants holds more power than any overseer with a whip." Hannah learned to identify every plant on the plantation grounds. She knew that willow bark could ease pain, that foxglove could slow a racing heart, and that castor beans could cause violent illness. Most importantly, she learned about oleander, the beautiful flowering shrub that grew wild throughout South Carolina. Every part of the oleander plant was deadly poisonous, but it was nearly impossible to detect in food if prepared correctly. "Why are you teaching me this, Mama?" young Hannah asked one day when she was 12, watching Celia carefully separate dangerous plants from cooking herbs. Celia looked toward the main house, where they could hear Master Whitmore shouting at one of the field hands, "Because knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you, child. They can sell your body, break your spirit, but they can't steal what's in your head, and sometimes what's in your head is the only weapon you got." Hannah's childhood was marked by the constant brutality that defined slave life. She watched her friends sold away from their families without warning. She saw grown men whipped until they couldn't stand, women violated by overseers, children worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. But it was a specific incident when she turned 14 that would shape the rest of her life. On a sweltering August morning in 1834, Hannah's younger brother Moses, only 10 years old, was caught taking a peach from the Whitmore's orchard. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The slave rations had been reduced because the cotton crop was smaller than expected. The boy was simply starving. Thomas Whitmore decided to make an example of Moses. He ordered all the slaves to gather in the courtyard to witness what happened to thieves. Hannah stood frozen as her baby brother was tied to the whipping post. The first lash tore through his small shirt. The second drew blood. By the 5th lash, Moses had stopped crying and hung limply from his bonds. "Please, master," Celia cried out, breaking from the group. "He's just a child. He's just hungry." Whitmore turned his cold grey eyes toward Celia. "Hungry? Well then, let's give him something to really cry about." He nodded to the overseer, who raised the whip again. 20 lashes later, Moses hung unconscious. Hannah counted every single one, burning the number into her memory. 20 lashes for a 10-year-old boy who took one peach because he was starving. As the other slaves dispersed, Hannah helped her mother carry Moses back to their cabin. He would survive, but he was never quite the same, his spirit broken along with several ribs. That night, as Hannah held cold cloths to her brother's wounds, something fundamental shifted inside her. The fear that had always lived in her chest transformed into something else, a cold, calculating hatred that would burn steady as a candle flame for the next 13 years. "Mama," she whispered in the darkness, "tell me more about those plants. Tell me everything." From that night forward, Hannah's education took on a darker purpose. During her morning walks to collect herbs for cooking, she began gathering other specimens. She learned that moonflower seeds could cause hallucinations, that pokeweed berries could cause respiratory failure, that deathcap mushrooms looked remarkably similar to safe varieties but would shut down the liver within days. She began experimenting on rats first, then on sick chickens that were going to be killed anyway. She learned about dosages, about timing, about how different poisons affected the body. Most importantly, she learned about subtlety. A good poisoner, she realized, made death look like accident or natural causes. As Hannah grew older, her position in the house evolved. By age 16, she had become her mother's primary assistant, responsible for preparing breakfast and lunch, while Celia handled the more elaborate dinner preparations. This gave Hannah unprecedented access to the Whitmore family's daily routines. She learned that Thomas Whitmore took his coffee black with 2 spoons of sugar every morning at exactly 7 o'clock. Eleanor Whitmore preferred tea with honey and always ate toast with orange marmalade. James Whitmore, now 22 and as cruel as his father, liked his eggs over easy and his bacon crispy. She learned their schedules, their habits, their preferences, and their weaknesses. Hannah also began building relationships with slaves on other plantations. The network of communication between plantations was sophisticated. Field hands who traveled between properties, house slaves who accompanied their masters to social events, and the freedmen who worked as artisans in Charleston all carried information back and forth. Through this network, Hannah learned that the cruelty she experienced wasn't unique to the Whitmore plantation. She heard stories of masters who worked slaves to death, of families torn apart and sold to different states, of women brutalized and children abandoned. She heard about plantation owners who threw elaborate parties while their slaves ate scraps, who built grand mansions while their workers lived in conditions worse than their livestock. But she also heard whispers of resistance. She learned about slaves who had successfully escaped via the Underground Railroad, about small acts of sabotage that cost masters money, about work slowdowns that disrupted harvests. Most intriguingly, she heard rumors about other house slaves who had taken more permanent action against particularly brutal masters. There was a cook up in Virginia, an old field hand named Samuel told her during one of the rare times she was allowed to visit the quarters. Name of Martha. Her master used to beat his slaves with an iron poker, leave them scarred for life. One day old Martha put something special in his stew. They found him 3 days later, stiff as a board. Doctor said it was his heart, but Martha knew better. What happened to Martha? Hannah asked. Samuel shrugged. Nothing. Nobody suspected the cook. Master's brother inherited the plantation, treated folks a whole lot better. Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways. These stories planted seeds in Hannah's mind. She began to see patterns. Masters who died under mysterious circumstances often had histories of exceptional cruelty. The deaths were always attributed to natural causes or accidents, but Hannah began to suspect there was a network of house slaves taking justice into their own hands. By 1840, Hannah had become the most trusted house slave on the Whitmore plantation. At 20 years old, she was beautiful, intelligent, and completely invisible to the white family she served. They spoke freely in front of her, discussed business and politics, revealed their fears and prejudices, never imagining that she was listening to every word and remembering everything. She learned that Thomas Whitmore owed significant money to banks in Charleston, that the plantation was struggling financially, and that he was considering selling several slave families to pay his debts. She discovered that James Whitmore was planning to marry a young woman from Savannah, whose father owned 3 plantations, a union that would make the Whitmores one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. Most disturbingly, she learned about their future plans for the plantation's slaves. During a dinner party in late 1840, she overheard Thomas telling his guests about his intention to breed his slaves more systematically, treating them like livestock to maximize profit. The key is selective breeding, he explained, whine making his voice louder than usual. Keep the strong bucks, sell off the weak ones, force the women to mate with the best specimens. In 10 years, I'll have the finest slave stock in the Carolinas. Hannah froze in the doorway, a tray of dirty dishes in her hands. He was talking about her friends, her family, her people, as if they were animals. She thought about her mother Celia, now 45 and showing signs of arthritis from decades of kitchen work. She thought about Moses, still bearing scars from his childhood whipping. She thought about the young women in the quarters who would be forced into Thomas Whitmore's breeding program. That night, Hannah made her decision. She would not wait for freedom. She would not hope for rescue. She would not pray for deliverance. Instead, she would deliver justice herself, using the one weapon at her disposal, her knowledge of plants, her access to food, and her invisible position in the house. The next morning, Hannah began her careful preparations. She started gathering oleander leaves, drying them slowly and grinding them into a fine powder that looked remarkably similar to black pepper. She tested her mixture on rats, perfecting the dosage needed to cause death that would look like heart failure. She studied the Whitmore family's breakfast routine with new intensity, noting exactly how much sugar Thomas added to his coffee, how Eleanor stirred her tea, how James seasoned his eggs. For 6 months, Hannah planned every detail. She couldn't act impulsively. One mistake would mean not just her death, but brutal punishment for every slave on the plantation. She had to be perfect, patient, and completely invisible until the moment she struck. As winter turned to spring in 1847, Hannah felt ready. The Whitmores had become even more cruel over the harsh winter months, taking out their financial frustrations on their slaves. 3 field hands had died from overwork and malnutrition. 2 women had been sold to settle debts, torn away from their children and husbands. The breaking point came when Thomas Whitmore announced his intention to sell Moses to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a death sentence disguised as a sale. On the night of March 14, 1847, Hannah lay awake in her small room behind the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the plantation. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow she would serve breakfast for the last time. Tomorrow, the Whitmore family would pay for 13 years of brutality with their lives. As dawn broke over Charleston Harbor, Hannah rose and began preparing what would become the most infamous breakfast in South Carolina history. The morning of March 14, 1847, began like any other at the Whitmore plantation, but Hannah Morrison knew it would be the last ordinary day of her life. As she walked through the morning mist toward the kitchen house, carrying a basket of eggs from the chicken coop, she heard the sound that would seal the fate of the Whitmore family, the jangle of slave chains coming up the dirt road. A slave trader's wagon was approaching the plantation, drawn by 2 tired mules. Hannah recognized the driver immediately, Josiah Fletcher, one of Charleston's most notorious slave dealers. Fletcher specialized in buying slaves from financially struggling plantations and reselling them to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the average life expectancy was less than 7 years. Thomas Whitmore emerged from the main house, already dressed and clearly expecting Fletcher's arrival. Hannah ducked behind the kitchen building and listened as the 2 men conducted their business. "I can pay you $800 for the boy," Fletcher said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "That Moses has some size on him, and the sugar masters like them strong. Won't last long, but they'll get good work out of him first." "$800 seems fair," Whitmore replied. "He's been trouble anyway. Maybe Louisiana will teach him some respect." Hannah felt her world tilt. Moses, her baby brother who had never fully recovered from that childhood beating, was being sold to what amounted to a death sentence, and Thomas Whitmore was discussing it like he was selling livestock, not destroying a human life. "I'll take him today," Fletcher continued. Got a ship leaving Charleston Harbor tomorrow morning. Easier to transport them when they don't have time to say goodbye to family. Makes them more cooperative. As Hannah crouched behind the kitchen, something inside her snapped. All the years of careful planning, all the patient preparation, none of it mattered now. Fletcher would chain Moses and drag him away before Hannah could execute her carefully laid plans, unless she acted immediately. But as she watched Fletcher inspect Moses like he was examining a horse for purchase, Hannah realized this wasn't just about saving her brother anymore. This was about sending a message that would echo across every plantation in South Carolina. The house slaves of the region had been whispering for years about taking action. Hannah would be the one to fire the first shot. She spent the rest of that morning refining her plan with deadly precision. The Whitmore family always ate breakfast together at 7 o'clock sharp. Thomas, his wife Eleanor, and their son James. They were creatures of habit, which made them predictable targets. More importantly, they always ate in the main dining room away from the kitchen, which meant Hannah would have several minutes between serving the food and the family actually eating it. But timing would be everything. Too much oleander powder, and they would taste it. Too little, and they might survive. Hannah had spent months calculating the exact dosage needed for each family member based on their weight and eating habits. Thomas weighed approximately 200 pounds and always ate heartily. Eleanor was smaller, maybe 130 pounds, but she picked at her food. James was young and strong, probably 170 pounds, and he ate quickly. Hannah retrieved her carefully prepared oleander powder from its hiding place, a small ceramic jar buried beneath the kitchen floorboards. The powder was so fine, it looked identical to black pepper, and she had tested it thoroughly on rats to ensure the dosage was lethal but undetectable. As she worked, Hannah's mind was calculating more than just poison dosages. She was thinking about the network of house slaves across Charleston and the surrounding plantations. Word would spread quickly about what happened at the Whitmore plantation, and Hannah wanted to ensure that word carried the right message. She had been building relationships with other house slaves for years through the complex communication system that existed between plantations. Sarah, who cooked for the Middleton plantation on the Ashley River, had been sharing information about her master's cruelties. Mary, a seamstress for the Pinckney family in Charleston, had been learning to read by secretly studying her mistress's letters. Rebecca, who managed the household for a rice plantation near Georgetown, had been documenting every instance of sexual abuse she witnessed. These women were part of an informal network that Hannah had been cultivating since she turned 18. They called themselves the Invisible Army, house slaves who moved through white society completely unnoticed while gathering intelligence and planning small acts of sabotage. A spoiled batch of preserves here, a ruined dress there, mysterious accidents that cost their masters money and time. But what Hannah was planning went far beyond petty sabotage. She was planning murder, and she needed her network to understand the significance of her actions. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated justice. She was declaring war on behalf of every slave who had been beaten, sold, violated, or murdered by the plantation system. Hannah had spent the previous evening sending coded messages through the slave communication network. Field hands who traveled between plantations carried her words to house slaves throughout the Lowcountry. The cook sends word that tomorrow's breakfast will be specially seasoned. She hopes her neighbors will remember the recipe. Every house slave in the region would understand the message. Hannah was telling them that she was finally ready to act, and they should be prepared for the consequences that would follow. As Hannah prepared the breakfast that would make history, she thought about the broader implications of her actions. She had been studying the white family's conversations for years, learning about their fears, their financial troubles, and their political concerns. She knew that plantation owners throughout the South were already nervous about slave rebellions, especially after Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia 16 years earlier. What Hannah understood, and what made her plan so sophisticated, was that fear was more powerful than violence. Killing the Whitmore family would certainly be satisfying revenge, but it would also terrify every plantation owner in the region. They would realize that their most trusted slaves, the ones who prepared their food, cared for their children, and knew their most intimate secrets, could turn against them at any moment. Hannah had observed how white families interacted with their house slaves, and she had identified their greatest vulnerability. They trusted the very people they oppressed. Thomas Whitmore never questioned the food Hannah served him. Eleanor Whitmore never worried that her tea might be poisoned. James Whitmore never considered that the young woman who cleaned his room might be planning his death. This trust was based on the white community's racist belief that enslaved people were naturally subservient and lacked the intelligence to plan sophisticated resistance. Hannah intended to shatter that illusion permanently. If this story is gripping you, don't forget to like the video and comment what you would do in the protagonist's place. Subscribe for more powerful narratives of struggle and survival. The psychological aspect of Hannah's plan was as carefully crafted as the poison itself. She had spent years observing how the Whitmore family dealt with stress and conflict. Thomas became violent when challenged. Eleanor retreated into denial when faced with unpleasant realities. James relied on his father's authority to solve problems. None of them would be prepared to handle the systematic elimination of their power structure. More importantly, the other plantation owners in the region would be forced to confront the reality that they were vulnerable in their own homes. Hannah also understood the legal implications of her actions. South Carolina law in 1847 was clear. Any slave who killed a white person would be executed, usually by public hanging. But Hannah had studied enough mysterious deaths of cruel masters to know that house slaves could often avoid suspicion if they were careful. The key was making the deaths look natural. Oleander poisoning mimicked heart failure almost perfectly. The victims would experience chest pain, difficulty breathing, and eventual cardiac arrest. In an era before modern forensic science, it would be nearly impossible to prove poisoning, especially if the victims had been under stress or had pre-existing health conditions. Thomas Whitmore had been complaining about chest pains for months, attributing them to financial worries. Eleanor suffered from what she called nervous conditions and often felt faint. James drank heavily and had gained weight over the past year. All three had plausible reasons for sudden heart problems. Hannah's plan also accounted for what would happen after the deaths. She knew that suspicion would initially fall on field slaves, especially those with histories of defiance. The white community would assume that any resistance came from the dangerous slaves who worked in the fields, not from the trusted house slaves. This gave Hannah several advantages. First, she would be above suspicion during the initial investigation. Second, she would be in a position to influence the narrative by sharing information about potential suspects. Third, she could use her position to help other slaves avoid punishment for crimes they didn't commit. But Hannah's ultimate goal went beyond simply avoiding capture. She wanted to start a revolution, and revolutions required more than one successful action. She needed to inspire other house slaves to follow her example, while also avoiding the massive crackdown that would follow if white authorities understood the true scope of the conspiracy. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity. She would make her action look like an isolated incident, while secretly communicating its true significance to other house slaves. The white community would see the Whitmore deaths as a tragic accident or the work of a single disturbed individual, but the enslaved community would understand that Hannah had declared open war on the plantation system. To achieve this, Hannah had developed a sophisticated communication strategy. The coded language she had been using for years would allow her to spread the real story of what happened without alerting white authorities. Phrases like "the cook's new recipe" or "breakfast was especially satisfying" would let other house slaves know that poisoning was a viable form of resistance. More importantly, Hannah had been teaching other slaves to identify and prepare plant-based poisons. During her visits to other plantations, she had shared her knowledge of oleander, foxglove, castor beans, and other deadly plants that grew wild throughout South Carolina. She presented this information as medical knowledge, teaching them which plants to avoid to keep their families safe. But the most observant slaves understood the dual nature of this education. Plants that could heal could also harm, and knowledge of deadly vegetation could be a powerful weapon in the right hands. Hannah had also been documenting the cruelties of masters throughout the region, creating a mental catalogue of which plantation owners deserved to die first. She had identified at least a dozen masters who were exceptionally brutal, including several who regularly raped their female slaves, and one who had worked 3 slaves to death in the past year. These men would be the next targets if Hannah's plan succeeded. She had already begun sharing information about their daily routines, their food preferences, and their vulnerabilities with the house slaves who served them. As the sun climbed higher on March 15, 1847, Hannah made her final preparations. She carefully measured portions of oleander powder for each member of the Whitmore family, double-checking her calculations one last time. She reviewed the morning routine, confirming that she would have the necessary window of opportunity to doctor their food without being observed. Most importantly, she prepared herself psychologically for what she was about to do. Hannah had never killed anyone before, but she had been preparing for this moment for years. She thought about Moses, who would be chained and dragged away to Louisiana if she didn't act. She thought about her mother Celia, whose arthritis was getting worse from decades of kitchen labor. She thought about every slave who had been whipped, sold, raped, or murdered on the Whitmore plantation. But Hannah also thought about the future she was trying to create. Every house slave in the region would hear about what happened at the Whitmore plantation. Some would be inspired to take similar action. Others would find new courage to resist in smaller ways. A few might even find the strength to escape. The revolution Hannah was starting wouldn't be fought with guns or swords. It would be fought with poison and patience, with intelligence and invisibility. It would be a war waged by the people white society trusted most and suspected least. As Hannah lit the fire in the kitchen hearth and began preparing what would become the most infamous breakfast in South Carolina history, she whispered a prayer to the ancestors who had survived the Middle Passage, endured centuries of bondage, and passed down the knowledge that was about to change everything. The time for patience was over. The time for justice had arrived. And Hannah Morrison, the invisible cook who had spent her life serving the people who oppressed her, was about to serve them their final meal. March 15, 1847, dawned gray and humid over the Whitmore plantation. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the ancient oak trees lining the dirt road to the main house, and an unseasonable fog rolled in from Charleston harbor, muffling the usual sounds of morning activity. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Hannah Morrison rose before dawn, as she had every morning for the past 7 years, but today her hands were perfectly steady as she dressed in her plain cotton work dress and wrapped her hair in the faded blue head wrap that had belonged to her mother. Today there was no fear in her heart, only the cold certainty of justice finally arriving. At 5:30, she walked through the misty courtyard to the kitchen house, her bare feet silent on the brick walkway. The familiar weight of the kitchen keys hung from her belt, keys that gave her access to every pantry, every spice cabinet, every secret ingredient that would make this morning's breakfast unforgettable. The kitchen was her domain, her battlefield, her temple of revenge. Hannah lit the great fireplace with practiced efficiency, the orange flames casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. She filled the iron kettle with water from the well and hung it on the crane to heat. Every movement was deliberate, ritualistic, as if she were performing a sacred ceremony that had been centuries in the making. From her hiding place beneath the loose floorboard, Hannah retrieved the small ceramic jar containing her oleander powder. The substance looked innocent enough, a fine grayish powder that could easily be mistaken for black pepper or ground herbs. But Hannah knew this powder held the power to topple empires, to strike fear into the hearts of slave owners across the entire South. She had calculated the dosages with scientific precision. Thomas Whitmore, at 200 pounds, would require approximately 2 teaspoons mixed into his coffee. Eleanor, much smaller and more delicate, would need only 1 teaspoon in her morning tea. James, young and strong but also the quickest eater, would get 1.5 teaspoons sprinkled over his eggs and grits. The timing had to be perfect. The Whitmore family maintained rigid breakfast schedules. Thomas always came down at exactly 7 o'clock for his coffee and newspaper. Eleanor followed at 7:15 for her tea and toast. James stumbled down at 7:30, usually hungover from the previous night's drinking, demanding his eggs and bacon before he rode out to oversee the field hands. Hannah began her deadly ballet of preparation. She ground fresh coffee beans, the rich aroma filling the kitchen with false normalcy. She sliced thick pieces of bread from yesterday's loaf, arranging them on the silver serving tray that Eleanor preferred. She cracked eggs into a blue ceramic bowl, their golden yolks bright as summer sunshine, sunshine that the Whitmore family would never see again. At 6:45, Hannah heard the familiar sound of Thomas Whitmore's heavy footsteps on the main house's wooden floors. He was an early riser, proud of his discipline, often boasting that successful planters were made in the hour before dawn. This morning, his punctuality would be his death sentence. Hannah's heart remained calm as she poured the boiling water over the coffee grounds, watching the dark liquid drip into the pewter pot. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind thousands of times. With movements as smooth as silk, she lifted the coffee pot and added Thomas Whitmore's sugar, 2 heaping spoonfuls, just as he liked it. Then, with the same casual motion, she added 2 teaspoons of oleander powder, stirring the mixture until it dissolved completely. The deadly coffee looked identical to every other cup she had served him. The oleander was tasteless and odorless when properly prepared. Thomas Whitmore would drink his death without ever knowing it was coming. Next came Eleanor's tea. Hannah selected the finest Ceylon leaves from the locked spice cabinet, a luxury that Eleanor insisted upon even as she denied her slaves adequate food. The irony was not lost on Hannah as she measured the tea into the delicate porcelain pot that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. Boiling water transformed the leaves into a golden amber liquid, beautiful and innocent-looking. Hannah added Eleanor's preferred honey, 2 small spoonfuls from the jar imported from Savannah. Then, with the same steady hand that had prepared thousands of harmless meals, she stirred in 1 teaspoon of oleander powder. The honey masked any texture that might have given away the poison's presence. As the clock on the kitchen mantel chimed 7 times, Hannah heard Thomas Whitmore's study door open. He was coming for his coffee, just as he had every morning for the past decade. Hannah arranged his cup on the silver tray alongside the morning's copy of the Charleston Mercury, which carried news of Congress debating the expansion of slavery into new territories. How fitting, Hannah thought, that Thomas would read about the future of slavery while unknowingly drinking his own death. She carried the tray to the main house with the same unhurried pace she had maintained for years. No one would remember anything unusual about this morning that was crucial to her plan's success. Thomas was already seated at his massive mahogany desk when Hannah entered the study, his grey hair gleaming with pomade, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed the world existed for his pleasure. "Good morning, Hannah," he said without looking up from his papers. "Weather's clearing up nicely, should be perfect for the cotton planting." "Yes, master," Hannah replied, her voice betraying nothing as she set the coffee cup at his right elbow. "Perfect weather indeed." Thomas lifted the cup and took his first sip of poisoned coffee at exactly 7:03. Hannah watched from the corner of her eye as he drank deeply, then set the cup down with a satisfied sigh. The oleander was already entering his bloodstream, beginning its deadly work on his cardiovascular system. Hannah returned to the kitchen to prepare Eleanor's breakfast. The mistress of the plantation preferred to take her morning meal in the sunroom, overlooking her prized rose garden. Eleanor fancied herself a delicate southern belle, despite being 43 years old and harder than railroad iron when it came to punishing slaves. The tea service was an elaborate ritual that Eleanor insisted upon. Fine china, silver spoons, linen napkins, and fresh flowers from the garden. Hannah arranged everything with meticulous care, knowing that Eleanor would examine every detail for imperfections. The poisoned tea sat innocently in its porcelain pot, looking exactly like the hundreds of other pots Hannah had prepared over the years. At 7:15 precisely, Hannah knocked softly on the sunroom door. Eleanor was already seated at her small round table, dressed in a morning gown of pale yellow silk, her graying hair arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her slave maid an hour to perfect. "You're exactly on time, Hannah," Eleanor said, with the satisfied tone of a woman who believed punctuality in slaves was a reflection of her superior household management. "Pour the tea, please, and make sure it's not too strong. I have a delicate constitution this morning." Hannah poured the poisoned tea with the same steady hand that had served Eleanor for 7 years. The liquid flowed golden and perfect into the delicate cup, steam rising like incense from its surface. Eleanor added her usual splash of cream and stirred with the silver spoon that had belonged to her great-grandmother. "Perfect temperature," Eleanor murmured after her first sip, taken at exactly 7:18. "How you do make the most wonderful tea, Hannah. I don't know what I would do without you." If this story is gripping you, don't forget to like the video and comment what you would do in the protagonist's place. Subscribe for more powerful narratives of struggle and survival. Hannah bowed her head respectfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Will there be anything else?" "No, dear. Just let James know his breakfast is ready when he comes down. You know how he gets when his food isn't waiting." Hannah returned to the kitchen for the final preparation. James Whitmore was the youngest and cruelest member of the family, a 24-year-old man who treated slave women as his personal property and slave men as objects for his violent amusement. He had been the one to suggest selling Moses to the Louisiana sugar plantations, laughing about how the boy would learn respect the hard way. James liked his eggs over easy, his bacon crispy, and his grits swimming in butter. Hannah prepared his breakfast exactly as he preferred, then carefully sprinkled the oleander powder over the eggs and stirred it into the grits. The powder was virtually invisible against the yellow eggs and pale grits, and James always ate too quickly to notice subtle changes in texture or taste. At 7:32, James Whitmore stumbled into the dining room, his hair disheveled from sleep and his clothes rumpled from the previous night's drinking. He was already in a foul mood, shouting for his breakfast before he had even sat down. "Where's my food, Hannah? I told you I needed to be in the fields early today." We're starting the new cotton planting, and those lazy field hands need constant supervision. Hannah set his plate before him without comment. James immediately began shoveling food into his mouth, eating with the graceless hunger of a man who had never known want. He consumed the poisoned eggs in 4 large bites, followed by the deadly grits, washing everything down with milk that Hannah had not tampered with. She wanted him to taste every bite of his death. By 7:45, all 3 members of the Whitmore family had consumed their poisoned breakfast. Hannah began the normal routine of cleaning dishes and preparing for the day's other meals, her face showing no emotion as she waited for the oleander to take effect. The first symptoms appeared within 20 minutes. Hannah heard Thomas's voice from the study, initially just a confused grunt, then a more concerned call for Eleanor. By 8:15, both parents were in the dining room, Thomas complaining of sudden chest pain and Eleanor feeling dizzy and nauseous. "Must be something in the air," Thomas muttered, loosening his collar as sweat beaded on his forehead. "Damn humidity always affects my breathing." James finished his breakfast and stood to leave for the fields, but immediately sat back down as a wave of weakness washed over him. "I feel strange," he said, his voice already becoming slurred. "Like I can't catch my breath." Hannah continued her kitchen work, listening as the family's confusion turned to concern, then to growing panic. Eleanor was the first to realize that something was seriously wrong. "Thomas, your face is grey," she said, her own voice becoming weak and thready. "And James looks terrible. Maybe we should call for Dr. Morrison." But even as Eleanor spoke, she was struggling to remain upright in her chair. The oleander was attacking her smaller body more quickly, causing her heart to race irregularly as her blood pressure dropped. Thomas tried to stand and immediately collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest as pain radiated down his left arm. Can't breathe," he gasped. "Something's wrong, very wrong." James attempted to call for help, but the words came out as an unintelligible croak. His young, strong body was fighting the poison, but the dose Hannah had calculated was sufficient to overwhelm even his natural resilience. By 8:30, all 3 family members were experiencing the full effects of oleander poisoning. Their hearts were beating irregularly, their breathing was labored, and their blood pressure was dropping to dangerous levels. The dining room, which had been filled with casual breakfast conversation 30 minutes earlier, now echoed with gasps and moans of increasing distress. Hannah appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by their cries, her face a perfect mask of concern and confusion. "Master? Mrs., is everything all right? I heard calling." Thomas tried to speak, but could only point weakly toward the kitchen, as if suspecting that something in the food had caused their illness. But oleander poisoning was virtually undetectable, and Thomas's suspicions would die with him. Eleanor managed to whisper, "Get help, doctor, something wrong." Hannah nodded and ran toward the slave quarters, ostensibly to send someone for medical assistance, but she knew that no doctor could arrive in time to save the Whitmore family, and even if one did, there was no antidote for oleander poisoning in 1847. By the time Hannah returned to the main house, claiming that she had sent a field hand to fetch Dr. Morrison from Charleston, Thomas Whitmore was unconscious, and James was convulsing weakly in his chair. Eleanor was still barely conscious, her eyes wide with fear and confusion as she realized she was dying. "Hannah," Eleanor whispered, reaching out with a trembling hand. "Help us, please." Hannah knelt beside Eleanor's chair, taking the dying woman's hand in hers. For a moment their eyes met, and Hannah saw the exact instant when Eleanor realized the truth. The recognition flickered across Eleanor's face, understanding that the trusted house slave who had served her family for years had just murdered them all. But Eleanor was too weak to speak, too close to death to raise an alarm. She could only stare at Hannah with eyes that held terror, betrayal, and a dawning recognition of the justice she had never seen coming. Thomas Whitmore died first, his heart stopping at 8:57 as he slumped forward onto his breakfast table. James followed 5 minutes later, his young body finally succumbing to the poison that had overwhelmed his cardiovascular system. Eleanor lasted the longest, her smaller dose taking nearly an hour to complete its deadly work, but she finally drew her last breath at 9:15, her hand still clasped in Hannah's. As the clock chimed 9:30, Hannah Morrison stood alone in the dining room with the bodies of her former masters. The most powerful family in their corner of South Carolina lay dead around their breakfast table, victims of a revenge that had been 7 years in the planning. Hannah felt no joy, no satisfaction, no relief, only the cold certainty that justice had finally been served. The Whitmore family had spent decades treating human beings as property, and now they had paid the ultimate price for their cruelty. But more importantly, Their deaths would send a message throughout the South that would change everything. The revolution had begun, and it would be fought with poison and patience, intelligence and invisibility. The age of the untouchable plantation master was over, and it had ended with a breakfast that would be remembered long after the last slave was freed. The silence that followed Eleanor Whitmore's final breath was deafening. For 7 years, Hannah Morrison had lived in a world where every moment was filled with the sounds of her oppression, orders being shouted, whips cracking, chains rattling. Now, as she stood in the dining room surrounded by the bodies of her former masters, the plantation had fallen into an unnatural quiet that felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. Hannah moved with deliberate calm, her mind already calculating the dozen steps that would determine whether she lived or died in the coming hours. She had spent years planning this moment, but the real test of her intelligence would be how she handled the aftermath. First, she needed to establish her alibi and control the narrative that would follow. Hannah walked calmly to the plantation bell and rang it 3 times, the signal for medical emergency that would bring the overseer and several field hands running to the main house. Then she returned to the dining room and arranged herself in the perfect pose of a horrified house slave who had discovered a tragedy. When Jack Morrison, the plantation's white overseer, burst through the front door with 2 field hands behind him, he found Hannah kneeling beside Eleanor's chair, apparently trying to revive her mistress with smelling salts from the medicine cabinet. "Lord, have mercy!" Jack exclaimed, taking in the scene of 3 dead bodies around the breakfast table. "What happened here, Hannah? What in God's name happened?" Hannah looked up with tears streaming down her face, tears that were real, though not for the reasons Jack would assume. She was crying for Moses, who was still chained in the slave trader's wagon, awaiting transport to Louisiana. She was crying for her mother Celia, whose arthritis-twisted hands had prepared thousands of meals for people who treated her like an animal. She was crying for every slave who had died under the Whitmore's cruelty. But to Jack Morrison, she appeared to be a grief-stricken house slave mourning her beloved masters. "I don't know, Master Jack," Hannah sobbed. "I served them breakfast like always, then went to tend the kitchen garden. When I came back to clear the dishes, I found them like this." Master Thomas was clutching his chest and Mrs. Eleanor was calling for help. But by the time I got to her, Hannah let her voice trail off into convincing despair. Jack knelt beside Thomas Whitmore's body, checking for a pulse he would never find. "Must have been his heart," he muttered. "Man's been complaining about chest pains for months. The financial troubles have been eating at him something fierce." This was exactly the conclusion Hannah had hoped he would reach. Thomas Whitmore's known heart problems provided the perfect cover for oleander poisoning, which mimicked cardiac arrest almost perfectly. "But what about Mrs. Eleanor and Master James?" asked Samuel, one of the field hands who had crowded into the dining room. "They was both young and healthy." Jack stood up, running his hands through his hair as he tried to make sense of the scene. "Sometimes these things run in families. Bad hearts, weak constitutions, or maybe it was something they ate. Food poisoning can kill quick if it's bad enough." Hannah suppressed a bitter laugh. Jack Morrison was unknowingly telling the absolute truth. It had indeed been something they ate, and it had killed them quickly, but he would never suspect that the poisoning had been deliberate, carried out by the very woman who now knelt weeping beside their bodies. "Samuel, ride to Charleston and fetch Dr. Morrison," Jack ordered. "Hannah, you stay here and watch over them. Don't let anybody else in this room until the doctor arrives." As the men scattered to carry out his orders, Hannah found herself alone again with the Whitmore family's corpses. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the critical hours when her performance would determine whether she was seen as a grieving servant or a suspected murderer. She began meticulously cleaning the breakfast dishes, washing away every trace of the oleander powder that had delivered justice to the Whitmore family. The pewter coffee pot was scrubbed until it gleamed. The porcelain teacup was washed and dried with careful attention to every detail. The plates that had held James's poisoned eggs were cleaned so thoroughly that not even a microscope could have detected evidence of what had killed him. But Hannah's most important task was managing the information that would shape the investigation to follow. She had spent years cultivating relationships with house slaves throughout the Charleston region, and now it was time to activate that network. While waiting for Dr. Morrison to arrive from Charleston, Hannah sent carefully coded messages to her allies on neighboring plantations. The messages were carried by field hands who traveled between properties and couched in the seemingly innocent language that slaves had developed to communicate under their masters' noses. To Sarah, the cook at the Middleton plantation, breakfast didn't agree with the family today. They all took sick after eating. Thought you should know in case there's something bad going around. To Mary, the seamstress for the Pinkney family. Lost the whole family this morning. Hearts just gave out one after another. Strangest thing anybody ever seen. To Rebecca, who managed households near Georgetown. The master's coffee was too strong this morning. Won't be needing any more breakfast service here. Each message carried multiple layers of meaning that would be understood by house slaves, but sound perfectly innocent to any white person who overheard them. Hannah was simultaneously establishing her cover story, alerting her network to what had happened, and sending a coded signal that the revolution she had been planning was finally underway. Dr. Morrison arrived from Charleston at 2 o'clock that afternoon, an elderly man with kind eyes who had been treating the Whitmore family for over a decade. Hannah watched from the kitchen as he examined each body, checking for signs of trauma or obvious illness. The doctor's conclusion was exactly what Hannah had hoped for. Appears to be cardiac failure, he told Jack Morrison. Thomas had been complaining of chest pains and shortness of breath for months. The stress of his financial difficulties finally caught up with him. Sometimes when one family member dies suddenly, the shock can trigger similar episodes in relatives, especially if there's a hereditary weakness of the heart. Jack nodded gravely. So you don't think it was anything they ate? No poisoning or anything like that? Dr. Morrison shook his head. I see no evidence of poisoning. Their faces aren't discolored. There's no foam around the mouth. No signs of convulsions or vomiting. This looks like natural death, albeit tragically sudden and affecting the entire family. Hannah continued her kitchen work while listening to this conversation, her face maintaining the perfect expression of grief-stricken confusion. Dr. Morrison's pronouncement meant that there would be no investigation into the food she had prepared, no testing of the dishes she had already cleaned, no suspicion directed toward the house slaves who had access to the family's meals. The news of the Whitmore family's death spread through Charleston society like wildfire. By evening, the plantation was crowded with neighbors, relatives, and curiosity seekers who came to pay their respects and speculate about the tragedy. Hannah moved through these crowds like a ghost, serving refreshments to the mourners while listening to their conversations. The white community was genuinely shocked by the suddenness of the deaths, but no one suspected foul play. Instead, they talked about the financial pressures that had been weighing on Thomas Whitmore, the delicate constitution of Southern ladies like Eleanor, and the tragic irony of a young man like James dying before his prime. But Hannah was most interested in the conversations she overheard about the plantation's future. Thomas Whitmore had died deeply in debt, and his property, including all his slaves, would have to be sold to satisfy his creditors. This meant that Moses would indeed be sold to the Louisiana sugar plantations, along with most of the other slaves on the property. However, Hannah had prepared for this possibility. Among the mourners was Elizabeth Whitmore, Thomas's spinster sister who lived in Charleston and had always disapproved of slavery on moral grounds. Elizabeth had inherited enough money from their father to purchase some of the Whitmore slaves, and Hannah had been cultivating a relationship with her for months. During the funeral preparations, Hannah approached Elizabeth with perfectly calculated humility. Miss Elizabeth, ma'am, I don't mean to trouble you in your grief, but I'm worried about what's going to happen to my family when the plantation gets sold. Elizabeth, a kind-hearted woman in her 50s who had been influenced by the growing abolitionist movement, looked at Hannah with genuine sympathy. Oh, my dear, I know this must be terrifying for you. I've been thinking about that very problem. My mama Celia's got the arthritis real bad, Hannah continued. And my little brother Moses, he's not strong enough for the sugar plantations. I was praying that maybe you might consider buying us when the estate gets settled. Elizabeth had been planning to make exactly this offer. She had observed Hannah's loyalty to the family over the years and had been impressed by her intelligence and capability. More importantly, Elizabeth had been looking for a way to act on her anti-slavery convictions without completely shocking Charleston society. I think that could be arranged, Elizabeth said quietly. I'll speak to the estate lawyers about purchasing you, your mother, and your brother. I can't afford to buy all the slaves, but I can certainly save your family. This conversation was the culmination of months of careful manipulation. Hannah had studied Elizabeth's character, understood her moral conflicts about slavery, and positioned herself as the perfect solution to Elizabeth's desire to help without appearing too radical. Elizabeth thought she was performing an act of Christian charity, but she was actually being recruited into Hannah's network of resistance. The funeral of the Whitmore family was held 3 days later at St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Charleston, with half the city's elite society in attendance. Hannah stood in the back of the church with the other slaves, her head bowed in apparent mourning, while she listened to the minister praise Thomas Whitmore as a godly man who had treated his slaves with Christian kindness. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but Hannah endured it because she knew the truth that no one else in that church suspected. She had delivered justice to a family of murderers, and their deaths would inspire other enslaved people to follow her example. Over the following weeks, as the Whitmore estate was dissolved and the slaves were sold to new masters, Hannah began to hear whispers from her network that confirmed her plan was working. House slaves throughout the Charleston region were talking about the mysterious deaths at the Whitmore plantation. The official story was heart failure, but the enslaved community was developing its own theories. The coded messages Hannah had sent immediately after the deaths were being discussed and analyzed by house slaves who understood their hidden meanings. Sarah at the Middleton plantation had begun experimenting with plant-based preparations that could cause illness in cruel overseers. Mary in Charleston was teaching other house slaves to identify poisonous plants during their marketing trips to the city. Rebecca near Georgetown was documenting the daily routines of particularly brutal masters, information that could be used by anyone planning similar actions. Most importantly, the fear that Hannah had hoped to create was spreading through the white community. Plantation owners throughout the Lowcountry were suddenly nervous about their house slaves, wondering if the people who prepared their food and knew their most intimate routines could be trusted. Several masters began requiring their house slaves to taste their food before serving it. Others started varying their daily routines to make themselves less predictable targets. A few particularly paranoid plantation owners even hired food tasters or insisted on preparing their own meals. This fear was exactly what Hannah had intended to achieve. For the first time in the history of American slavery, house slaves were being viewed as potential threats rather than trusted servants. The psychological warfare that Hannah had initiated was working. If this journey moved you, subscribe, like, and comment which part of the story touched you most. Your engagement keeps these voices alive and inspires new content about resistance and courage. 3 months after the Whitmore family's death, Hannah was settled into her new life as Elizabeth Whitmore's house servant in Charleston. Her mother, Celia, worked as the cook, her joints gradually improving with better food and lighter duties. Moses was employed as a general servant, safe from the sugar plantations that would have killed him within a year. But Hannah's real work was just beginning. Living in Charleston gave her access to a much larger network of house slaves, and she used this opportunity to spread her knowledge and philosophy throughout the city's enslaved community. She began teaching other house slaves about medicinal and poisonous plants during their Sunday gatherings at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She shared techniques for identifying and preparing substances that could cause illness or death without detection. Most importantly, she taught them about patience, planning, and the psychological warfare that could be more effective than open rebellion. Hannah's methods were spreading beyond Charleston. Through the complex communication networks that connected enslaved communities across the South, word of the Whitmore deaths and their suspected cause reached house slaves in Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, and beyond. By 1850, there were reports of suspicious deaths among plantation owners throughout the region. A cruel master in Virginia died suddenly after breakfast. A brutal overseer in Georgia succumbed to mysterious heart problems. A slave trader in Alabama was found dead in his office after drinking his morning coffee. The white community attributed these deaths to natural causes, but the enslaved community understood them as evidence of a growing resistance movement. House slaves who had once felt powerless were beginning to realize that they held life and death power over their oppressors. The psychological impact on the white community was profound. The comfortable assumption that house slaves were naturally subservient and loyal was being shattered by a growing awareness that these trusted servants might be plotting their masters' deaths. This paranoia contributed to the increasing polarization between North and South that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Southern planters became more isolated, more defensive, and more convinced that their entire way of life was under attack. Meanwhile, abolitionists in the North began hearing whispers about the slave resistance movement that was spreading through Southern plantations. Frederick Douglass wrote in his newspaper about the growing spirit of resistance among the enslaved population, though he was careful not to explicitly endorse violence. Harriet Tubman, who was already conducting her Underground Railroad operations, began incorporating Hannah's techniques into her network. She taught escaping slaves to identify poisonous plants that could be used against pursuing slave catchers, and she spread word about house slaves who were fighting back against their oppressors. Hannah's influence extended beyond immediate resistance activities. Her example inspired other forms of slave rebellion: work slowdowns, tool sabotage, and the preservation of African cultural practices that white society was trying to eliminate. The network of house slaves that Hannah had created became a sophisticated intelligence operation that gathered and shared information about abolitionist activities, underground railroad routes, and opportunities for escape or resistance. By 1860, as the nation moved towards civil war, Hannah Morrison had become a legendary figure among enslaved people throughout the South. Her story was told in whispered conversations in slave quarters, coded into spirituals sung in the fields, and passed down through oral traditions that would survive long after emancipation. When the Civil War finally began, Hannah was 41 years old and still working as Elizabeth Whitmore's house servant in Charleston, but she had also become the unofficial leader of a resistance network that stretched across the entire Confederate States. As Union forces approached Charleston in 1863, Hannah used her network to provide crucial intelligence about Confederate troop movements, supply lines, and defensive positions. The house slaves who had learned from her example were perfectly positioned to gather military information while remaining invisible to their Confederate masters. When Charleston finally fell to Union forces in February 1865, Hannah Morrison walked out of Elizabeth Whitmore's house a free woman. She was greeted by Union officers who had heard about her intelligence work and wanted to recruit her for post-war reconstruction efforts. But Hannah had different plans. She spent the remaining years of her life documenting the stories of enslaved resistance that had been hidden from white society. She traveled throughout the South, interviewing former slaves and recording their accounts of rebellion, sabotage, and survival. Hannah Morrison died in 1889 at the age of 69. Her funeral in Charleston was attended by hundreds of former slaves who credited her with inspiring their own acts of resistance. She was buried in an unmarked grave, but her legacy lived on in the stories told by the people she had helped free. The impact of Hannah's actions continued long after her death. Her techniques influenced the civil rights movement of the 20th century, particularly the emphasis on psychological warfare and the strategic use of positions of trust to undermine oppressive systems. Modern historians studying slave resistance have identified the 1840s and 1850s as a turning point when enslaved people began using more sophisticated methods to fight back against their oppressors. While official records rarely acknowledge the role of poisoning in slave resistance, the pattern of suspicious deaths among particularly cruel masters suggests that Hannah Morrison's example inspired a widespread movement. Today, Hannah Morrison is remembered as one of the most effective resistance fighters in American history. She proved that intelligence and patience could be more powerful than violence, that the most trusted servants could become the most dangerous enemies, and that revolution could begin in a kitchen with nothing more than knowledge, courage, and a handful of poisonous plants. Her story reminds us that resistance takes many forms, and that those who appear most powerless may actually hold the greatest power to change the world. The breakfast she served on March 15, 1847, was more than just a meal. It was a declaration of war that helped bring about the end of American slavery. The revolution had begun with poison and patience, and it ended with freedom for 4 million enslaved Americans. Hannah Morrison, the invisible cook who changed history, had served her final meal, and it was justice itself.